Social studies. A couple of things first. I want to go over your answers or the questions that we did on Monday and Tuesday. There was a little bit of confusion, and some of your answers didn't make a lot of sense. So, the first question, why do you think the British thought that the French sending soldiers and building forts in the Ohio Valley was considered an act of war? All right, so imagine this. We're here in Sellersburg or in Indiana, wherever. All of a sudden, people from outside of Indiana all of a sudden show up in Sellersburg and start building forts and sending in soldiers. And we don't know these people. They just start building forts and sending in soldiers. Why would we think that would be an act of war? Well, one, they're soldiers. That's what they do. They fight for the most part, especially if they're coming to your area in a mass group, a large group. So, yeah, that would be considered an act of war in by itself, is a bunch of troops walking in. Now, I'm not talking about the National Guard called in to maybe help regulate like a football game or a sporting event like the Kentucky Derby or something where there's going to be a lot of people for crowd control. I'm talking soldiers coming in armed to your area and building forts. Building forts means they want your land. They're not building a fort just to have a fort built. Okay, there's a reason for it. So those are a couple of reasons that you could have used why it could have been considered an act of war. Well, there's soldiers, there's a fort. Usually those are consistent with war, especially back in the 1700s, which what we're dealing with. Tuesday's question was, why do you think Native American tribes were why some Native American tribes were allies with the British and some with the French? Again, there's a large coast, and if you look up here on this screen I have up here, you can see the French and the British territories. Well, there's different Native American groups on each one of those. And with that being said, depending on their area, yeah, they were more accustomed to the French or they were more accustomed to the British, and those were the ones that they were going up with. On the flip side of the coin, maybe if the British was mean to a group of Native Americans, they might want to side with the French to think it would be better for them, or vice versa. If some of the French were mean to some of the Native Americans, they might want to be paired up with the British to get a better deal than what the French gave them. And so there's a lot of different reasons, but those were kind of a couple of reasons that we're looking for. For the most part, the Native Americans didn't really get along with any of them because they were losing their land. So somewhere when they decided to pick, they were, I guess, hoping that they would get some land, or maybe they were cool with a couple of the groups where they actually did have some land. Not all Native Americans were kicked out, but a lot of them were. So that's what kind of what I was looking for on those questions. So today, the French and the Indian War expands, and we're going to start reading here. It says the colonists knew, the British colonists, they knew that they needed help if they were going to win the war. Parliament, which was the lawmaking branch of the British government over in England, sent an army to help fight the French and their Native American allies. General Edward Braddock led the British. So what's happening here is if you look on this map in the pink, those are the British territories. Those are the ones that the French wanted to claim. The British colonists knew that in order to win this war, this battle, so they can control this land, they needed some help. So they contacted across the Atlantic Ocean over to England and said, hey, we needed some help. So the Parliament, the English Parliament, the government, the British Parliament, again, those are all words. They're all British, England. All of them are the same people group, just different names. They decided to send over some soldiers to help. And they needed that help. So now this war is starting, and it says early defeats for Britain. It's an early defeat, that means early in the war, Britain was losing, or the British were losing. Let's see what it says. It says in April 1755, Braddock, that was General Edward Braddock, and more than 1,800 troops marched to attack the French at Fort Duquesne. Braddock brought George Washington along as an advisor. Washington later described how the soldiers looked in their bright, colorful uniforms. British red and colonial blue, marching through the deep green forest. So again, we mentioned the red coats last time, and that was the uniform that they wore, a red coat. And so what they're doing is they're walking through nature. Trees. Remember, this is trees that had been untouched. So it's like forest. These men wearing red coats were walking through the forest. You could see them. They were sitting ducks. There was no camouflage on them. They were easily seen. The British soldiers had been trained to fight in open fields. They were surprised to find that the French fought like their Native American allies from behind trees and large rocks. This made the British soldiers easy targets. The early battles did not go well for the British, and Braddock was killed in the fighting. In a letter home to his family, this is what George Washington wrote. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot underneath me, and yet I escaped unhurt. Lots going on here. I want to explain it to you real quick. Back in the 1700s, there was kind of an art to war. Basically, it kind of looked like a chessboard. I'm sorry, I got distracted there. Girls are yelling. Sorry about that. Um, on one side would have been the British. Then there would have been a field, and on the other side would have been the French and their Native American allies. They're people that are helping them. Normally, what the rule of war was, they started marching toward each other, and whoever basically won. Well, that's what, when the British showed up, this is what they expected. So as they're marching to start this fight, there was a surprise waiting for them. The French did not fight that way. The French, they were hiding behind trees, camouflaged, and whenever they could see the British, they just started firing at them. So there was no art to it. It was a sneak attack. The British was not prepared for this, and they lost pretty bad. What George Washington said was he actually got shot 4 times through his coat. That means the bullet went through his coat or his uniform, but missed his body. Guns were not as accurate as they are now back then in the 1700s, so that is a possibility. He also said that 2 different horses, they were shot while he was riding them. So while he was riding these horses, the horses were shot. Basically, he would have fell off of them. But again, he was unhurt, and we know George Washington's story as his life progresses. But this was a new type of war for the British. The red coats, the red uniforms, not a good idea. Expecting just to march in and have a battle like on a chessboard, not a good idea. So the British had some early defeats. And so we're going to stop here for today. They're going to have to come up with a new game plan because that game plan is not a good one. So we'll see what happens next. Go to Schoolology for 1 question day. Pretty easy. If you listen to this at all, you'll figure out what the answer is. Again, 2 complete sentences. Thanks, guys.